Luke, a 15-year-old black teenager, sat quietly on a bench in the bustling city square, his large backpack resting at his feet. Across from him, Mary, a middle-aged white woman, couldn't take her eyes off him. Her gaze narrowed as she watched Luke unzip his bag to take out a water bottle. In her mind, the sight of the backpack became something far more suspicious. "What does he have in there?" she muttered under her breath. "Could it be a weapon? Stolen goods?" Mary's grip on her phone tightened. Her breath quickened as she tried to rationalize her growing unease. Finally, she dialed 911. Her voice quivered, but was firm with urgency as she spoke. "Hi, I'd like to report a suspicious individual. There's a black teenager here in the square with a large bag. He's acting strange, and I think he might have a weapon or something stolen. Please send someone quickly." Satisfied, Mary ended the call and leaned back, convinced she had acted in the interest of public safety. Across the square, Luke remained oblivious, sketching quietly in his notebook, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. Moments later, the piercing sound of sirens filled the square. 2 police cars pulled up, their lights flashing red and blue. Luke froze, looking around in confusion as officers stepped out, scanning the scene until their eyes landed on him. A small crowd began to gather, murmuring amongst themselves, some pulling out their phones to record the unfolding drama. Luke stood slowly, his hands visible, his face a mixture of fear and bewilderment. But before the officers could approach, a sleek black SUV rolled into the square. The crowd's murmurs grew louder as the car door opened, revealing an imposing figure in a tailored business suit. Rachel Carter, Luke's mother and a respected state legislator, stepped out. Her presence was commanding, and the tension in the air thickened as everyone realized this encounter was about to take an unexpected turn. What will happen next? Are you curious to see how this powerful mother turned the entire situation around? Don't forget to hit like, share this video and subscribe to our channel now to stay updated with more inspiring stories every day. The city of Maplewood was a picturesque place where charm met progress. Rows of brick buildings lined the streets, adorned with hanging flower baskets that seemed to bloom year-round. The city square was the beating heart of Maplewood, a place where locals and visitors gathered to enjoy its vibrant atmosphere. On any given day, the square buzzed with the life of families, street performers, and people simply passing time under the warm sun. Among the crowd, Luke sat quietly on a worn wooden bench, his presence almost unnoticeable amidst the hustle and bustle. At 15, Luke was a tall, lanky boy with a thoughtful demeanor. His dark curls framed his face, and his large brown eyes were constantly scanning his surroundings, not out of suspicion but out of curiosity. He was always observing, always looking for stories to tell through his art. Today, Luke wore his usual outfit, a plain grey hoodie, a pair of slightly faded jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. At his feet was his large backpack, which he carried everywhere. Inside were his essentials, a couple of school books, his prized sketchbook, a set of art supplies, and a water bottle. Luke loved that bag. It had been a birthday gift from his mom, Rachel Carter, a few years ago. Though it had started to fray at the seams, Luke refused to part with it. Luke wasn't like most kids his age. While many of his peers were glued to their phones or social media, Luke found joy in simpler things, sketching, walking through nature, and reading history books. His teachers often described him as introspective and gifted, though sometimes too quiet for his own good. Growing up as the son of Rachel Carter, a state legislator, had its perks and pressures. Rachel was a trailblazer in the community, known for her tireless advocacy for equality and justice. She had won her seat through sheer determination and a promise to fight for marginalized voices. For Luke, Rachel wasn't just a politician. She was his role model, but her work often meant long hours and late nights, leaving Luke to navigate much of his teenage years independently. That day in the square, Luke was sketching scenes around him. His pencil danced across the paper as he captured the fountain's cascading water, the pigeons pecking at crumbs, and the vibrant energy of the children playing nearby. Drawing was Luke's escape, a way to channel his thoughts and emotions into something tangible. Yet, as he sketched, Luke couldn't shake a peculiar feeling. It was subtle, like an itch at the back of his mind, a sense that someone was watching him. He glanced up briefly, scanning the square, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Shrugging it off, he returned to his art, unaware of the eyes locked onto him from across the way. Mary Simmons had been a resident of Maplewood for over 2 decades. In her early 50s, she carried herself with an air of self-assurance, often boasting about her instincts and ability to read people. Mary liked to see herself as the unofficial neighborhood watch, a role she had appointed herself long ago. On that sunny afternoon, Mary had chosen her usual spot in the square, a bench shaded by a large elm tree. She had just finished her coffee and was scrolling through her phone when she noticed Luke for the first time. Her gaze lingered on him longer than it should have, her mind spinning narratives that had no basis in reality. Mary's attention drifted to Luke's backpack, a large, slightly worn bag that sat next to him. She frowned. Why does he need such a big bag? She wondered. What's he carrying in there? In her mind, the bag became a symbol of danger, a container for something forbidden or illegal. Mary's thoughts spiraled further as she watched Luke sketch. Was he drawing the square to plan something? Why wasn't he playing like the other kids? Why wasn't he talking to anyone? Her suspicions deepened when Luke opened his backpack to retrieve a water bottle. Mary caught a glimpse of what appeared to be pencils, erasers, and other items she couldn't identify. That could be anything, she thought. Maybe he's hiding something dangerous. Meanwhile, across town, Rachel Carter was wrapping up a meeting at the state capitol. At 43, Rachel was a force to be reckoned with, a woman of principle, intelligence, and unshakable resolve. As one of the few black state legislators in the region, Rachel's journey to public office had been anything but easy. She had faced resistance at every turn, from subtle microaggressions to outright hostility. But Rachel was undeterred. She believed in the power of representation and the importance of standing up for what was right. Her day had been packed with meetings about educational reforms and community programs. Despite her demanding schedule, Rachel always made time for Luke. She had promised to pick him up that afternoon, though she was running a bit late. As she glanced at the clock in her office, she smiled, thinking about her son. Luke was her greatest pride, her anchor in a world that often felt overwhelming. Rachel grabbed her keys and headed out, unaware of the brewing storm in Maplewood Square. Back in the square, Mary's anxiety reached its peak. She couldn't shake the feeling that Luke didn't belong there. Her grip on her phone tightened as she contemplated her next move. Should she confront him? No. That could be dangerous. Should she ignore it? No. That wasn't like her. Mary's self-proclaimed responsibility to protect the community wouldn't allow her to let it go. Finally, Mary made the call. Her voice was steady but laced with urgency as she spoke to the 911 operator. Hi, I need to report something suspicious. There's a black teenager here in the square. He's carrying a large backpack, and I think it might be a weapon or something stolen. He's been sitting here for a while, and it just doesn't feel right. Please send someone quickly. As she hung up, Mary felt a surge of satisfaction. She believed she had done her duty as a vigilant citizen. What she didn't realize was that her assumptions, rooted in fear and bias, were about to set off a chain of events that would ripple through the community. Luke remained unaware of the unfolding drama. He had moved on to a new sketch, a detailed portrait of the fountain's cascading water. His pencil strokes were swift yet deliberate, capturing the movement and sparkle of the water droplets. Around him, the square continued its rhythm of life, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension. But that feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. Luke glanced up again, his eyes briefly meeting Mary's. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something about her stare that made him uneasy. He shifted in his seat and returned to his sketch, dismissing the interaction as a coincidence. Unbeknownst to him, the wheels of misunderstanding and prejudice had already been set in motion. The sound of approaching sirens was just moments away. The peaceful ambience of Maplewood Square shattered with the wail of approaching sirens. A pair of police cars pulled up abruptly, their flashing red and blue lights bathing the square in a surreal glow. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Families turned to look. Children froze mid-play. It was as if the entire square had collectively held its breath. Luke looked up, confused by the sudden commotion. He watched the officers step out of their vehicles, their eyes scanning the crowd. At first, he thought nothing of it. Police presence in the square wasn't unusual, but when their gazes locked onto him, a wave of unease crept up his spine. 2 officers began to approach, their footsteps deliberate and heavy. Luke, sensing their focus on him, instinctively placed his pencil down and straightened in his seat. His heart began to pound. What's going on? Why are they looking at me? He felt the weight of the moment press against his chest, though he still didn't understand why. Mary watched from her bench. Satisfaction etched across her face. "They're here," she whispered under her breath, her fingers clutching the edge of her purse. She felt validated, even heroic, as if her call had single-handedly prevented a disaster. "Excuse me, son," one of the officers called out as they reached Luke. "Can we have a word with you?" Luke blinked, his mind racing. "Me?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Yes, you?" the taller officer replied, his tone firm but not yet aggressive. "We received a call about a suspicious individual. Can you explain what you're doing here?" Luke swallowed hard, his confusion deepening. "I'm just sitting here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was drawing while waiting for my mum." The shorter officer glanced down at Luke's bag. "What's in the backpack?" he asked, his voice more direct now. Luke instinctively reached for the bag, but the taller officer raised a hand. "Slowly," he warned. "Just open it slowly." By now, a small crowd had formed. Some people whispered amongst themselves, their eyes darting between Luke and the officers. Others pulled out their phones, recording the scene. The tension in the air was palpable, a mix of curiosity, concern, and quiet judgment. "Mommy, what's happening to that boy?" a young girl asked, tugging on her mother's sleeve. "I don't know, sweetheart," the woman replied, her tone hushed. "Let's just watch." Luke unzipped his bag carefully, his hands trembling. He pulled it open to reveal its contents: a sketchbook, a set of pencils, a few school books, and a water bottle. Nothing more. The officers exchanged a look. The taller one cleared his throat. "Why are you carrying such a big bag if you're just sitting here?" he asked. Luke frowned, unsure how to respond. "It's my school bag," he said, his voice faltering. "I always carry it." Mary, emboldened by the officer's presence, decided to step in. She walked up to the group, her heels clicking against the cobblestones. "I'm the one who called," she announced, her voice steady. "I saw him sitting here with that oversized bag, and I thought it looked suspicious. I mean, why does a kid need to carry all that around? Who knows what he might be hiding?" Luke turned to face her, his confusion turning to frustration. "I'm not hiding anything," he said firmly. "I was just drawing." Mary crossed her arms. "That's what you say," she retorted, her tone dripping with doubt. "But how do we know that's true?" The officers, sensing the growing tension, exchanged another glance. "Ma'am," the shorter officer said, addressing Mary, "thank you for your concern, but we're handling this now." "I'm just saying," Mary continued, ignoring the officer, "we can't be too careful these days. You never know who might be dangerous." Luke's jaw tightened. He felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he forced himself to stay calm. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "Always keep your composure. Never give them a reason to escalate." Just as the situation seemed poised to spiral further, the sound of a car engine cut through the murmurs of the crowd. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the square, its tinted windows gleaming under the afternoon sun. The crowd turned toward the vehicle, their curiosity piqued. The driver's door opened, and Rachel Carter stepped out. Dressed in a sharp navy blazer and heels, she exuded confidence and authority. Her face was a mask of calm, but her eyes burned with a mix of anger and concern as she took in the scene. "Mom," Luke called out, his voice breaking with relief. Rachel's gaze immediately found her son, and her chest tightened at the sight of him surrounded by officers. She strode forward, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. The crowd parted instinctively, sensing her presence commanded respect. "Excuse me," Rachel said, her voice steady but firm. "What's going on here?" The taller officer straightened, clearly recognizing her. "Ma'am, we received a report about a suspicious individual in the square," he began. Rachel raised an eyebrow. "And that individual is my 15-year-old son?" Her tone was cool, but there was an edge to it that made the officer hesitate. "We're just following up on the report," the shorter officer interjected. "We're asking routine questions. That's all." Rachel turned to Luke, her expression softening. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked. Luke nodded, though his hands were still shaking. "I'm fine." "Mom, they just asked about my bag." Rachel's gaze shifted to Mary, who stood nearby with her arms crossed. "You made the call?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Mary nodded, her confidence faltering slightly under Rachel's piercing stare. I thought he looked suspicious," she stammered. "He had that big bag, and he was just sitting there." Rachel took a step closer, her eyes never leaving Mary's. "Suspicious because he was black? Because he had a bag? Or because he didn't fit your idea of who belongs here?" Mary opened her mouth to respond, but found she had no words. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as Rachel's words sank in. Some people nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uneasy glances. The officers shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that the situation was no longer just about Luke. It was about something much bigger. Rachel turned back to the officers. "I'd like to know why you felt the need to question my son in front of a crowd, as if he's a criminal," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the steel in her tone. The taller officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we were responding to a call. We didn't mean any harm. Harm has already been done," Rachel replied. "To him, to our community. Do you even realize what this looks like?" The officers glanced at each other, their confidence wavering. Mary, now visibly uncomfortable, took a step back. Her earlier certainty crumbled under the weight of Rachel's words and the stares of the crowd. "I didn't mean any harm," she mumbled, her voice barely audible. I thought, you thought wrong," Rachel said sharply, cutting her off. "Next time, think twice before you act on your assumptions. You could have put my son in real danger today." Mary looked down, shame washing over her. The crowd's attention shifted back to Rachel, who placed a protective hand on Luke's shoulder. "This," Rachel said, addressing the officers, "the crowd and Mary is exactly why we need to address the biases that plague our society. My son shouldn't have to justify his existence in a public space. No one should." As the tension began to dissipate, the officers stepped back, their postures less rigid. One of them muttered an apology, though it was clear the damage had already been done. Rachel guided Luke back toward their SUV, her hand never leaving his shoulder. The crowd slowly dispersed, their conversations buzzing with what they had just witnessed. Some applauded Rachel's handling of the situation, while others left with more questions than answers. Inside the car, Luke let out a shaky breath. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Rachel turned to him, her expression softening. "You never have to thank me for protecting you." "Luke," she said, "it's my job, as your mother and as someone who fights for what's right." As they drove away, the square returned to its usual rhythm, but the impact of what had happened lingered, leaving behind a community forced to confront its own biases. As Rachel and Luke drove away from the square, the ripples of the incident began to spread. Videos recorded by bystanders started circulating online within minutes, sparking immediate conversations across Maplewood. The scene of a young black boy being questioned by police while his powerful mother intervened became the talk of the town. But what exactly had caused the situation? What had led a woman like Mary to feel justified in her assumptions? For Mary, The aftermath was a whirlwind of regret and defensiveness. She found herself questioning her actions as she sat in her quiet home later that evening. The memory of Rachel Carter's stern, unwavering words echoed in her mind. "You thought wrong. Next time, think twice before you act on your assumptions." Meanwhile, back home, Luke sat at the dining table, his sketchbook closed for the first time that day. His usual enthusiasm for drawing had vanished, replaced by a sense of unease. The day's events had shaken him, leaving a bitter taste of injustice. "Are you okay?" Rachel asked as she placed a cup of tea in front of him. Luke hesitated before responding. "Why does it always have to be like this? Mom, why can't I just sit in the park without someone thinking I'm a threat?" Rachel sighed, her heart breaking at the raw pain in her son's voice. "It's not fair, Luke, and it's not right, but it's why I do what I do, to try and change the way people see things." Luke nodded, though his frustration lingered. "Do you think she really believed I was dangerous? Or was it just me?" Rachel placed a reassuring hand on his. "Sometimes people don't even realize the biases they carry. But that doesn't excuse their actions. What matters is how we respond. And today, you responded with grace and strength." Across town, Mary sat in her living room, her mind replaying the confrontation over and over. She had always thought of herself as someone who valued fairness and equality. But now, she couldn't deny the ugly truth staring back at her. She had acted out of prejudice. Her thoughts were interrupted by her teenage daughter, Grace, who had just come home from school. Grace, holding up her phone, asked, "Mom, is this you?" Mary's face went pale as she saw the video of herself at the square, already gaining traction online. The comments were brutal. Classic case of racial profiling. "People like her are the reason we need anti-bias training." She didn't even bother to ask the kid anything before calling the cops. I didn't mean for it to turn into this," Mary stammered. Grace frowned. "What did you think was going to happen?" "Mom, you can't just assume things about people because of how they look. Do you even know how scary that must have been for him?" Mary couldn't respond. For the first time, she realized that her intentions, no matter how she justified them, had caused real harm. The next morning, Rachel woke to find her phone buzzing incessantly. Messages from colleagues, constituents, and even journalists filled her inbox. The incident in the square had ignited a firestorm of discussion, with many calling for change. Rachel knew she couldn't let this moment pass without addressing it. After dropping Luke off at school, she headed to her office and began drafting a statement. Her words needed to strike a balance, calling out the injustice while opening the door for dialogue and growth. Yesterday's events in Maplewood Square were a stark reminder of the biases that persist in our society. My son, a 15-year-old boy doing nothing more than waiting for his mother, was treated as a suspect because of an assumption rooted in prejudice. This is not an isolated incident. It is a reflection of the larger issues we face as a community and as a nation. But moments like these can be opportunities for change. I will be advocating for the implementation of anti-bias training across all public service sectors in our city. Education and awareness are the first steps toward dismantling the harmful stereotypes that divide us. To those who watched this unfold and felt uncomfortable, angry, or inspired, I urge you to join the conversation. Change starts with each of us. Rachel's statement was met with a mix of praise and criticism. Many applauded her for addressing the issue head-on and pushing for systemic change. Others dismissed her words as overblown, arguing that Mary had simply made a mistake. At the same time, Mary found herself at the center of a growing backlash. Neighbors avoided her, and some even confronted her about her actions. Feeling isolated and ashamed, Mary decided to take a bold step. Later that week, Mary showed up at one of Rachel's community events. She stood at the back of the room, nervously clutching her purse as Rachel spoke about the importance of addressing implicit bias. When the floor opened for questions, Mary hesitated, but finally raised her hand. "I'd like to say something," she began, her voice shaking. All eyes turned to her, and for a moment, the room was silent. "I was the person who called the police on your son," Mary admitted, her face flushed with shame. And I was wrong. I let my own fears and assumptions cloud my judgment. And I'm so sorry for the pain I caused him. And you. The room buzzed with murmurs, but Rachel raised a hand, signaling for silence. Thank you for being here, Rachel said, her tone measured. Acknowledging our mistakes is the first step toward growth. What's important now is that we learn from this and work together to create a community where this doesn't happen again. Mary nodded, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope, the possibility of redemption. As the days passed, Luke began to process the incident in his own way. Encouraged by his mother, he decided to speak about his experience at his school's next assembly. Standing on the stage, Luke looked out at his classmates, many of whom had heard about what happened. What happened to me at the square wasn't just about me, he began. It's about the assumptions people make about others without knowing them. It's about how those assumptions can hurt, not just physically, but emotionally. But I also learned something important. We can use these moments to speak up, to educate, and to make sure they don't happen again. The applause that followed was thunderous. Luke felt a sense of empowerment he hadn't known before. His voice mattered, and he intended to use it. The events in Maplewood Square had uncovered deep-seated biases, but they also opened the door for change. Rachel's leadership, Luke's bravery, and even Mary's attempt at redemption set the stage for a community willing to confront its flaws and strive for something better. As the momentum for Rachel's anti-bias initiatives grew, so did the conversations around the incident. People across the city began examining their own biases, realizing that the journey to equality began with self-awareness and action. The mystery of that day in the square, why it happened, what it revealed, and how it changed lives, would remain a turning point for Maplewood, a reminder that even the smallest moments can spark the biggest transformations. The evening sun cast a warm golden glow over Maplewood Square, painting long shadows across the cobblestone paths. The square had returned to its usual rhythm, but something felt different. Conversations between neighbors seemed a little more thoughtful, glances a little more self-aware. The incident with Luke had left a mark, not just as a moment of tension, but as a catalyst for introspection and change. At home, Luke sat at his desk, flipping through his sketchbook. The pages were filled with scenes from the square, fountains, pigeons, and the faces of people who had unknowingly become part of his art. But as he turned to a blank page, he paused, pencil hovering in the air. This time, he didn't want to draw what he saw. He wanted to draw what he hoped for. His lines began to take shape, a group of people standing together. Their differences clear, but their unity stronger. A park filled with laughter and acceptance, where no one looked over their shoulder or whispered judgments. For the first time since that day, Luke smiled. Art wasn't just his escape anymore. It was his voice. Rachel sat at her desk, poring over proposals and emails. The outpouring of support following her statement had been overwhelming, but so had the resistance. Not everyone in Maplewood was ready for change, and Rachel knew the road ahead would be anything but smooth. Still, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The incident had reminded her why she had entered public service in the first place. It wasn't just about passing laws. It was about changing hearts and minds, one conversation at a time. In her speech at the next town hall, Rachel spoke with conviction. Moments like these test us, not just as individuals but as a community. They challenge us to reflect on who we are and who we want to be. Change doesn't happen overnight, but every step forward matters. Together, we can build a place where every child feels safe, every person feels valued, and no one is judged by the color of their skin. Her words resonated, drawing applause from those present and inspiring hope in many. For Mary, the journey had only just begun. She spent days reflecting on her actions, grappling with the reality of the harm she had caused. She attended one of Rachel's anti-bias workshops, sitting quietly at the back of the room, taking notes and absorbing the stories shared by others. One day, she approached Rachel after an event. Her voice trembled, but her resolve was steady. "I want to do better," she said. I know I can't undo what happened, but I want to be part of the solution." Rachel studied her for a moment before nodding. "Acknowledging the problem is the first step," she said. "The next step is making sure your actions align with your intentions." For the first time in weeks, Mary felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, but she was ready to take the journey. The ripple effects of the incident continued to spread. Conversations about implicit bias began cropping up at dinner tables, schools, and workplaces. Local leaders started taking Rachel's anti-bias training proposals seriously, and police officers began participating in community engagement programs. A mural appeared in Maplewood Square, painted by local artists and inspired by Luke's sketches. It depicted people of all backgrounds standing together, surrounded by symbols of unity and hope. The mural became a gathering place, a reminder of the lessons learned and the commitment to doing better. On a crisp fall morning, Luke and Rachel returned to the square. Luke carried his sketchbook, and Rachel carried a coffee. They sat on a bench, watching as children played and people strolled by. For the first time in a long time, Luke felt at peace. "Do you think things will really change?" "Mum?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. Rachel looked at him, her eyes filled with warmth and determination. "Change is never easy, Luke. It's slow, and sometimes it feels impossible. But every moment like this, every step forward, it matters. And as long as we keep pushing, things will get better." Luke nodded, his fingers tracing the edges of his sketchbook. "I think I'll draw something hopeful today," he said. Rachel smiled. "That's a good start." As the sun climbed higher, the square came alive with activity, a place transformed not just by its people, but by the hope they carried. The story of that fateful day in Maplewood Square was no longer just about what went wrong. It had become a story of what could be made right. This story is more than just a moment in time. It's a reminder of the change we all need to strive for. What do you think? Have you ever witnessed or experienced something like this? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe stories like this can spark meaningful conversations, don't forget to like this video and share it with your friends and family. Your voice matters in spreading awareness and creating a better future. And if you'd like to see more stories like this, ones that inspire, challenge, and bring hope, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. Together, we can be part of the movement toward a more inclusive and just world. Thank you for watching.